Henry VII and Elizabeth of York had 4 children who grew beyond childhood, 3 of whom would go on to become a monarch. Their 2 sons were Prince Arthur, and the second, more colourful character was Prince Henry, who would of course go on to become the most infamous monarch in English history, King Henry VIII. The stories of their 2 daughters are less covered, but both Princess Margaret and their younger daughter, Princess Mary, would lead extraordinary lives, with both causing scandals at the court of their brother, King Henry. The subject of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess podcast is the youngest of the Tudor siblings, Princess Mary, the princess who was described as the most beautiful woman in Europe, who would be a short-lived Queen of France before making an audacious and shocking marriage which temporarily saw her banished from court. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, Episode 11, The Life of Mary Tudor, Queen of France. Mary was the 5th born child to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. She came along 7 months after the King and Queen suffered the tragic loss of their second-born daughter, Princess Elizabeth, who died at the age of just 3, meaning that Queen Elizabeth was already pregnant with Mary when she and her husband lost their young daughter. In an unusual move, Queen Elizabeth chose to give birth to each of her children at different royal residences. Mary was born at Sheen Palace, which would later become known as Richmond Palace in what was then part of rural Surrey, just outside of London. She was a strong and healthy child, and by the age of 6 was given her own household. She was also educated as befitted her rank, learning how to speak French and Latin, and becoming proficient in the more traditionally female virtues of dance, music, and embroidery. Mary would spend a lot of time with her 2 middle siblings, Princess Margaret and Prince Henry. The eldest Tudor prince, Prince Arthur, as heir apparent, was schooled separately and spent much of his time in either the Welsh marches or by his father's side, whereas Mary and her other siblings spent a great deal of their time with the Queen herself. As children, Mary got on particularly well with her brother Henry, and it was in her honour that when Henry and Catherine of Aragon had a daughter years later, that they named her Mary. As a royal princess, Mary's life was almost entirely predetermined for her. She would not have ever expected to ascend to the throne of England herself. Instead, from the earliest age, she would have been raised to understand that her destiny would almost certainly be marriage to an overseas king. This was the norm for princesses of the blood, as Mary was, and was also something her elder sister Margaret grew up expecting. In 1506, Philip I of Castile visited England, and Mary, then aged 10, was called on to entertain the foreign guests by dancing and playing instruments. Shortly after the visit, Philip died and was succeeded by his son Charles. Charles would become the first person that Mary was betrothed to, and as he eventually went on to become the Holy Roman Emperor, Mary would have been an empress by marriage, a title even grander than queen. Sadly, as the other Princess Mary, Henry VIII's daughter, would later discover, royal betrothals were seldom seen to fruition, resting heavily on the state of politics across Europe, which were volatile to say the least. As such, the betrothal was eventually called off in 1513, when the politics of Europe and the royal court in England underwent major shifts in power. 4 years earlier, King Henry VII had died, and his second son Prince Henry ascended to the throne, aged 17. The elder Tudor Prince Arthur having died in 1502. The breakdown of Mary's betrothal was owing to a change in who the English court hoped to ally with. By now, Cardinal Wolsey was firmly on the scene and pulling many of the royal strings behind the scenes. It was he who suggested a peace treaty with France, combining the forces of England and her old enemy against the bigger and greater threat of the Holy Roman Emperor. Naturally, the peace treaty with France needed someone to sit at its core, and that person was Princess Mary. She was by now 18, making her the ideal age, by Tudor standards, for marriage, and so she was betrothed to the French king, Louis XII. The issue for Mary was that her bridegroom-to-be was old enough to be her grandfather. He was 52, reaching old age by the standards of the day, and must surely have felt ancient when compared to the stunning young princess. If there was any trepidation from Mary, she did not show it. In fact, she was described as being a most cheerful and easygoing character, famously blowing her future husband a kiss upon their first meeting. Mary's great beauty was regularly commented on, and is clear from the surviving portraits and sketches of her. The great Dutch humanist Desiderius Erasmus practically fell over himself in compliment of the princess, saying, "Nature never formed anything more beautiful." When she landed in France for the marriage to the French king, she was recorded as being handsome and well-favoured, while not her eyes and eyebrows too light. She is slight rather than defective from corpulence, and conducts herself with so much grace and has such good manners that for the age of 18 years, and she does not look more, she is a paradise. The marriage between Mary and King Louis took place on the 9th of October 1514. Upon marriage, Mary, naturally, became the Queen of France. She was accompanied to France by 4 maids of honour, one of which was none other than Mary Boleyn. On a quick side note, in Showtime's television series The Tudors, Princess Mary's storyline is weirdly merged with Princess Margaret's. Clearly, the showrunners felt that the audience would be utterly baffled by the idea of the king having 2 sisters. Mary's marriage to the King of France is turned into the King of Portugal. Oh, and she goes by the name of Margaret, not Mary. Upon marrying the gross and filthy Portuguese king, Margaret basically shags him to death. Seriously, Showtime? Come on. What were you thinking? In reality, it is true that Mary's tenure as queen was short-lived, her husband dying just 3 months into their marriage. And although there have been spurious suggestions that his death was brought about by overly ambitious nighttime exertions, in fact, Louis XII died of gout. Mary was therefore a widow at the age of just 18, and despite the new King Francis XIII attempting to keep Mary in France and wed her off to someone else, she returned to England and already had a new suitor set up in her mind. Mary was hopeful that this time she would be allowed to marry for love, not policy. For according to her letters to the king, she had agreed to the French marriage on the condition, if she were to outlive Louis, that she could then marry whoever she liked. Charles Brandon was the second son of Sir William Brandon, a relatively minor member of Henry VII's retinue who acted as standard-bearer at the Battle of Bosworth Field. His father's closeness to the king ensured that Charles was raised at court and soon became a great friend to the second Tudor prince, Henry. 7 years older than Prince Henry, he was known for his great stature, bravery, and passion for the hunt, both in the field and in the bedroom. Although Charles Brandon is often viewed as something of a lovable rogue, he was actually capable of staggeringly bad behaviour and would wantonly destroy lives in his seeking of riches. When, for example, in 1505, he was betrothed to marry a young woman, he went through the act of sleeping with her and getting her pregnant, which by canon law made them legally married, even though a marriage service hadn't taken place. He then went on to dump her and marry the poor girl's aunt, Margaret Neville, who had conveniently just been made a very, very wealthy widow. The marriage to Margaret was eventually annulled, and Brandon was ordered to return to Anne and marry her publicly, so that there could be no doubt as to the validity of their union. Anne gave Brandon a second daughter before she died in 1512. By now, Henry VIII was on the throne, and Brandon was his unquestioned bestie. The king knew all too well how Brandon acted. Indeed, it's likely that for a time Henry VIII hero-worshipped him, but it also meant that the king was privy to Brandon's less than noble activities, and this was the man that Mary Tudor had set her sights on. Naturally, the king wished to use Mary as a bargaining chip in a future marriage alliance, despite whatever promise that they had supposedly made. She was a princess of the blood, and her duty, as the times dictated, was to her brother and king. Mary had different ideas. Following the siege of Tournai in 1514, King Henry VIII created Charles the Duke of Suffolk, only the third duke in the country after the Dukes of Buckingham and Norfolk. This immediately made him one of the most senior noblemen in England, and he could therefore deputise for the king on important overseas activities. He was thus duly sent across to France to bring Mary home after the death of the French king, although he was also instructed by the king under no circumstances to consider proposing marriage to her. I think this was one of those moments where Henry VIII was keen to test his own powers and the loyalties of the people that he considered his friends. He knew what Brandon was like, and he had suspected that Mary had fallen for his lascivious best friend. Was this the king daring Brandon and his sister to contradict him? If so, it worked, for upon reaching France, Mary was able to convince Brandon that he should abandon his promise to the king and take her as his wife. They married in secret at the Hotel de Cluny, now known as the Museum de Cluny, with just 10 people in attendance, although one of those attendees was none other than King Francis himself. Mary and Charles Brandon knew their actions would cause explosions at the English court, and so Brandon began an immediate process of damage limitation, writing to tell Henry VIII that he had discovered Mary in such a state of sadness that he never saw a woman so weep. Clearly, he was attempting to pull on the king's rather minimal heartstrings. This was unsurprising, for Brandon had not only offended the king, but he had broken the law. And not just any law, he had technically committed treason. But under the Treasons Act at the time, marriage to a royal princess without royal assent from the monarch was treason. The Privy Council, men made up of the old noble houses, held a distaste for the upstarts such as Brandon and later Cromwell, hoping that this would be a great way of taking out one of the men that they held in contempt, and pushed the king to authorise Brandon's execution. Naturally, Mary herself would not suffer such extreme punishment, being born royal and moreover the king's favoured sister. This ensured that she was safe, although this did not lessen the king's fury at her behaviour. Although Henry VIII was known for his prickly nature and shocking willingness to bring down one-time favourites, there was clearly enough genuine affection there between himself and Brandon, for despite the severity of the crime, Brandon and Mary were eventually let off with a hefty fine of £24,000, around £8 million by modern standards. They were let off when Wolsey himself interceded on their behalf. As Wolsey was himself born of base stock, he likely sympathised with Charles Brandon and the snobbery that he endured from the more traditional men who sat on the King's Council. So complete was Mary and Charles Brandon's eventual return to favour that they later married again, this time officially, on the 13th of May 1515 at Greenwich Palace in the presence of the King himself. The most famous portrait of Mary is actually a double portrait of her and her husband and was painted shortly after their marriage. As Mary was now formally acknowledged as the wife of Charles Brandon, she also became the Duchess of Suffolk. However, her former title of Queen of France was grander and was the one that she continued to use during her own lifetime. She wouldn't be known as the Duchess of Suffolk until later. Mary would give her husband 4 children. Their firstborn was a son, Henry, naturally named for the king, and came along in 1516. Just a year later, Mary's nursery was expanded with their firstborn daughter, Frances, and 2 years later, another girl, Eleanor. In 1522, disaster struck when Henry Brandon died at the age of just 6. The following year, Mary gave birth to a second son, who she also called Henry. I know that sounds weird, but it was actually very common practice. The Tudors were not known for their naming versatility. In fact, in some instances, there were siblings who lived and shared the same given name. It must have been so confusing. The Brandons raised their children at Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk and were also joined by Charles Brandon's elder daughters Anne and Mary by his earlier marriage to Anne Brown. Mary became particularly close with her sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon. They shared much in common after all, both being born princesses to royal parents and shipped off to marry overseas rulers, although, as we know, Mary's tenure was far shorter than her friends would be. After Queen Catherine, Mary was the most senior woman in England and was duly treated with great deference by the other ladies of the court. She was also close to the other senior noblewomen of the time, such as Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, and Gertrude Courtenay, Marchioness of Exeter. Mary was conservative in religion and would in time show her distaste for religious reform. Mary was actively involved in much of the court revelries and was the most senior woman involved in the famous Chateau Vert pageant in 1522 to welcome the imperial ambassadors to Henry VIII's court. The pageant saw 7 virtues played by female members of Henry VIII's court, with Mary playing the role of beauty. The pageant was also the entree of a certain Anne Boleyn into the English court, who played the role, which would turn out to be spectacularly apt, of Perseverance, although this was actually pronounced Perseverance by the Tudors. I learnt that from Susanna Lipscomb. Within a few years of this pageant, Mary's loyalty to Catherine of Aragon would be put under intense strain, for it placed her on a collision course with Anne Boleyn, who it was said she utterly loathed. Mary made her distaste for Anne Boleyn well known and was utterly shocked that the sister of her one-time maid could overthrow the rule of Catherine of Aragon, a princess by birth. It is easy to understand Mary's own personal concerns here, not solely for her friendship with Catherine, but also for the precedents that it set for princesses of the blood being turned over for women of very base-born stock. The Brandons would eventually get caught up in a scandal involving Anne's own family. In March of 1532, Anne Boleyn was by now queen in all but name. Her uncle was the Duke of Norfolk, the most powerful and grandest duke in the kingdom, following the Duke of Buckingham's execution a few years earlier. An unknown man in the service of the Duke of Norfolk was joined by around 20 other followers who hunted down and killed a man called Sir William Pennington, who was a chief gentleman and kinsman of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. The murder took place in the sanctuary of Westminster and therefore caused major outrage at court. The story came from the Venetian ambassador Carlo Capello, who suggested that its origin was owing to Mary using slanderous language against Anne Boleyn. A quick side note, the chap who got murdered, Sir William Pennington, is actually my direct ancestor. He was my time 17 grandfather. It was even portrayed in the Tudors, one of the better things about the series. Despite her lifelong beauty and the very best physicians being at her disposal, Mary was not a particularly robust woman. She suffered from extended bouts of severe illness throughout her life. Her health was made all the more vulnerable when she contracted the dreaded sweating sickness in 1528. Although the sweating sickness was usually either deadly, and I mean within a matter of hours, or if someone overcame it, they would be better within a couple of weeks, there were rare examples of long sweating sickness, much like we have long COVID today. It appears that Mary suffered from long sweating sickness, never truly getting over it. In June 1533, she died, aged 37. She predeceased both her elder siblings, Henry VIII and Princess Margaret, Queen of Scotland. Her exact cause of death is unknown, but it has been speculated as either being a form of tuberculosis, known as consumption at the time, or possibly cancer. Naturally, her death was treated with great solemnity, for she was a king's daughter, a king's sister, and a one-time king's wife. A requiem mass was held for her in Westminster Abbey before her burial at Bury St Edmunds Abbey. Mary's eldest daughter, Frances, was the chief mourner, and it was said that she and her sister Eleanor were greatly affronted when, as Mary's body was being lowered into the ground, their half-siblings, Anne and Mary, pushed themselves to the front. A few years later, Mary's body was removed and reinterred at St Mary's Church, also in Bury St Edmunds, where she remains to this day. She was moved owing to the dissolution of the monasteries. Nearly 250 years later, Mary's coffin was once again opened, and this time locks of her hair were taken as keepsakes. The Georgians had a much more relaxed attitude to digging up old royalty. Although in Mary's most well-known portrait her hair appears to be a deep brown, the locks of hair taken from her head prove that she had the same chestnut red as her brother Henry. Just 2 months after Mary died, Charles Brandon married for a 4th time. His choice of bride was as equally shocking as it had been when he married Mary, for his new bride was the 14-year-old Catherine Willoughby, making her Brandon's junior by 35 years, and at one time she had actually been the intended wife for his own son by Mary Tudor. Despite this, the marriage appears to have been actually quite a happy one and produced two sons, Henry and Charles. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, died of natural causes at the age of 60 in 1545. For a man who spent practically his entire life at the court of Henry VIII, to die in his bed at a relatively old age was certainly rare. Very sadly, 6 years later, his two sons by Catherine Willoughby died of the sweating sickness on the very same day. 20 years after Princess Mary's death, her family became highly central to the dramas of July 1553. Mary's nephew, Prince Edward, the son of Henry VIII, had died at the age of just 15 and left his throne not to either of his sisters, but chose instead to leave his crown in the hands of Mary's eldest granddaughter, Jane, the daughter of Francis Brandon. It was the blood in Jane's veins as the great-granddaughter of Henry VII that placed her in the line of succession, but it was a reign which was famously the shortest in English history, lasting officially for 13 days, although often repeatedly referred to as 9 days. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and thus a niece of Princess Mary, Queen of France, now overthrew the rule of her granddaughter, Jane Grey, and would in time sign the warrant for her execution. Princess Mary, Queen of France and Duchess of Suffolk, remains one of the more elusive figures from Tudor history. As I referenced earlier, her story was weirdly merged with her own sisters in the television series The Tudors, and by and large she is forgotten about in film and television, save for the Starz series The Spanish Princess, which plays fairly hard and fast with the facts, but she is at least given a bit more screen time. She is nonetheless a fascinating figure, a woman who in many respects charted her own course despite the gilded cage in which she lived. Her bravery in marrying the man of her choice is to be applauded, even if it was highly dangerous at the time. The most famous part of Mary's story, ironically, is the period from which she provided legitimacy but was herself long dead and buried, the short-lived tenure of her granddaughter as Queen of England. And though that tenure was indeed short, and Jane never went through the process of a coronation, to some she was and should be remembered as Queen Jane. And so that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Next week, I will explore the life of King Henry VIII's fifth Queen, the scandalous and tragic Catherine Howard. In addition to my weekly episode, I also record a weekly subscriber-only episode, which can be accessed via my Patreon account at patreon.com/thetudorchest or via Apple Podcast subscriptions. Thank you for listening, and speak soon.